around 70 years ago, when India was locked up in hundreds of thousands of villages. India was a rural country. People lived in a caste society, rigid rules. They aspired, but it was very difficult to move outside the village. For some of you who haven't been to an Indian village, I can give you a little bit of a description. Most Indian villages are divided along caste lines. If you're a lower caste person, or if you were a lower caste person, for example, 70 years ago, you couldn't drink water from the village well. In certain spaces, certain villages, if your shadow fell on an upper caste person, the upper caste person would go and have a bath. And for all practical purposes, if you were from a lower caste or a backward caste, you pretty much had no mobility in the village. Forget about the country. 70 years ago, something beautiful happened in my country. We got independence, and we started a journey. A transition from a rural India to an urban India, many languages spoken in my country, many, many different states, different cultures, different ideas. We wanted all of them to be included in this sort of awakening, or in this transformation. The second idea was that this transformation would mean different levels of risk for different people. So poor people would face a higher risk in this transformation. They would have to make a much bigger change. They would have to move from a village to a city. The risks were much bigger. Certain communities, certain groups of people would struggle. Certain groups of people would require a cushion, maybe some help. Dalit communities, lower caste communities, tribal communities, minorities. So the idea was that as we transformed, the government should support its people, should help its people smoothen this traumatic transition, this traumatic change. So the government, pretty much all governments, until the last one, this one, 2014, Narendra Modi government, followed these two ideas very, very strongly. They do not feel that every single person in India should have access to the fruits of this transformation. They feel that tribal communities, poor farmers, Dalit communities, lower caste people, minorities, should not get the same benefits that the elite of the country get. And our point is that the risk was everybody's. Everybody took the risk, and we feel everybody should get the reward. The other thing they've done is they've started attacking the support structures that were designed to help certain groups of people. Very recently, a law that protected the Dalit community from violence was scratched down. The right to food was weakened. The right to guaranteed employment weakened. And all the money that used to go into these schemes is now going into the hands of very few people, the largest corporates in the country. But that's not the only damage they've done. There's something much more significant and dangerous that the government has done. This transition that took place on an informal economy, took place on the back of millions of small and medium businesses that allowed people from the villages to come to the cities, to do a job for a couple months, and then go back to the village. They acted like a shock absorber. A couple of years back, the Prime Minister demonetized the Indian economy. He basically said that 1,000 rupee and 500 rupee notes would be worthless. And he destroyed the cash flows of all these small and medium businesses. Millions and millions and millions of people who worked in the informal sector were left unemployed. I want to give you a sense of the scale of this. China produces 50,000 new jobs every 24 hours. In the same amount of time, in the same 24 hours, India, a country that is approximately the same size as China, produces only 450. And they didn't stop at demonetization. They imposed a badly conceptualized, badly thought through, badly implemented goods and services tax, which complicated the lives of these small and medium businesses, and basically resulted in the closure of hundreds of thousands of them. And large numbers of people who worked in these businesses were forced back to the villages. And these three things that the government has done has made India angry. And that's what you get to read in the newspapers. When you hear about lynchings in India, when you hear about attacks on Dalits in India, when you hear about attacks on minorities in India, that's the reason for it. That a huge, powerful transformation, which is frankly shaping the entire world, requires certain protections for its people. And that protection is being taken away. And India is reacting to that. You can disagree with somebody, but in a connected world, you have to listen to what they're saying, where they're coming from. As I said recently, hate is a choice. I can fight you, I can take you on, I can compete with you, but hating you is something that I actively have to choose to do. And I think hate is a dangerous thing in a connected world. So what we do in India and the Congress Party, we work with our people, we bring them together, we try and carry as many of them as possible in this transition. And we find that when you actually go and listen to people, and they might be very different than you, they might have a different cultural background than you, they might speak a different language. But when you actually start listening to people and try to understand where they're coming from, you can get a hell of a lot done. So I'd like to end my talk by telling you that I think there is a lot of hatred in the world today, but there is not enough listening. And I think listening is something that is very, very powerful.
You cannot fight hate with hate, but how do you fight violence? Because today we see many parts of the world where there is violence. How would you suggest that we fight that?
The only way you can fight violence is with non-violence. There's no other way. It's the same. There's no other way. You might be under the illusion that you can fight violence with violence, but it'll come back. You might think that you're very powerful and that you can subdue somebody else, but believe me, they'll find a way of coming back. Because violence is being caused because of a certain anger inside. Until you remove the anger, until you understand and remove the anger, it's going to remain there. So you can't fight violence with more violence. And of course, there are people out there who are so angry and so deeply infected by hatred that it'll take a huge effort. But I think that's the only way forward. That's the philosophy I believe in. Look, I've lost 2 members of my family. My grandmother and my father were both killed. So I've suffered violence. I'm talking actually from experience. I'm not talking without experience. And I can tell you that when you look at it properly, when you look at violence properly, there is only one way out of it. The only way you can move forward after violence is through forgiveness. There is no other way.
Where do you see India's role in the future when it comes to international relations? I mean, it's part of the BRICS countries and at the same time part of the IPSA countries, like the more democratic emerging markets. And I'm not so sure about which role India is going to play in the future. And I mean, from your party perspective, what role would you want India to play in the future?
I think there are a couple of potential visions out there. There is a American vision, there is a European vision, there is a Chinese vision, there is an Indian vision, there is a Islamic State vision. I mean, there are a bunch of visions that are competing. India has a relationship, strategic relationship with the United States. And India has a very deep set of ideas that we share with them. Democracy, freedom, etc. But India cannot ignore the fact that China is growing extremely fast and is going to shape the planet. So to me, India's role is actually to balance these two forces, much like Europe's. I think what would be the worst thing that could happen is that the Chinese and the United States get into a conflict. And I think that would be the absolute worst for the entire planet. And I think the Europeans and the Indians, because of their design, because of our design, are very well positioned to make sure that that conflict doesn't happen.
What your thoughts are about women's safety in India, because recently there was a quite critically challenged piece on Reuters about how India is probably one of the most unsafe countries for women in India, in the world. And I was wondering what your thoughts about this topic was.
I would disagree with the idea that India is the most unsafe place for women, but I would agree with the idea that the treatment of women in India leaves a lot to be desired. I think there is a huge amount of violence against women in India. A lot of it is visible, a lot of it is on the street. Huge amount of it is invisible, you never see it. It happens in houses. Women never talk about it. I think it is a cultural issue. It is an issue of how Indian men view Indian women. And I think it requires a huge amount of work to fix that problem. That's one component of it. The other component of it is that the level of violence in India, for the reasons I explained earlier, is increasing. And whenever the levels of violence increase, the people who are weakest bear the biggest brunt. So the fact that violence is increasing dramatically in India, women are actually getting a huge share of it. I think it is a tragedy. I think that is the single most important thing that India needs to do, is change the way its men view its women. And I think that is something that frankly is going to take a huge effort, but it is the duty of every single Indian to do it.